Hi, this is a quick introductory lecture to Soshanth 400. I realized not everyone could make it to campus on Tuesday, so I wanted to make sure that you had at least an introduction to the course. So this is what we went through then. Anyway, okay. The description you'll see on the syllabus, so this is pulled directly from the syllabus. What I'm trying to do is just bring together two sort of general areas of anthropological research. One is what we might call the anthropology of ethics, and that's sort of going to organize the focus of the course and of your research, where the interviews that you do will emphasize questions of ethics. I'll say more about that in a moment. And the other is a kind of approach within anthropology. It doesn't exactly have a name, but you could call it something like ordinary language anthropology, in that it draws on a body of philosophy called ordinary language philosophy. The details of that aren't important right now. We'll see more of that when we get into the readings. But many of these anthropologists who draw on these ordinary language concepts also write about ethics, employing those concepts to think about ethics. So not everyone we read falls into that camp, as you'll see, but these are the two sort of main theoretical or conceptual arenas that I'm trying to bring together in this course to organize the research that you'll do. The first thing that you're going to have to do for the course, though, is the City Human Subjects Protocol. So this is something that everyone has to do if they're doing research with human subjects. So whether it's psychology or sociology, with living subjects, I should say. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, it doesn't matter. If you're doing research where you're engaging with living people, you need to do things to protect their confidentiality, for example, and to make sure that the research that you're doing doesn't have any harmful consequences for them. And so this is this. It's not a long course. It's maybe 45 minutes to an hour and a half of your time, depending how quickly you move through it. It's not particularly challenging, but in that I've never had a student who hasn't been able to complete it. But what it will do is it will focus your attention on things that you should and should not do when you're doing your interviews. So, for example, don't interview minors unless there's a parent, say, present during the interview. But things like that, things that you can and cannot do, or that you should and should not do. So you'll do that before you do any interviews. I think you have like 3 weeks or something like that to get it done. So it's a fair bit of time to get that done. The next main assignment will be the literature review. Now, this is a new kind of writing for most students, and the way to differentiate it from the kind of writing that you've done in the past for other sociology courses or anthropology courses, for example, is that in those, you're typically developing an argument of some kind. You're putting together a thesis, right? So you're trying to organize theory and evidence together to argue a point, to say this is the state of affairs, right? Now, with a literature review, what you're trying to do is something different. It's a descriptive exercise, not an argumentative exercise. So what do I mean by that? Well, so one metaphor that I've used to try and explain this is, think of each one of the sources. So you're bringing in 5 sources into this literature review. Think of each source as an individual who's arrived at a cafe to talk over a particular topic, say ethics, with 4 other friends. And your job is you're outside this conversation listening to it. You want to describe that conversation between the different sources or between different people participating in the conversation. And you'll find that the conversation is going to move around a bit. There will be certain subtopics, like, say, the relationship between ethics and ordinary life, that 2 or 3 contributors will have something to say about. So you want to bring them together to say, here's how they discuss this subtopic. But then there will be a different subtopic that some other grouping of these 5 will talk to. I see now I've got the wrong authors up here. So the readings that I want you to use for this will be the theoretical readings that we start the semester with. So they're going to be Han, Al-Muhammad, and Peluso. Not Layla and Mattingly. They are going to be supplementary readings that you can use, but you don't have to. We're not discussing them in class. Zigon is going to be another one you'll see on the syllabus. We have a couple pieces by Lambeck. One by Lempert, who is critiquing Lambeck. So you get Lambeck's reading, Lempert critiquing Lambeck, and then you get Lambeck's response to Lempert. And then the final ones will be by Veena Das. Now, for the literature review, I want you just to pick 4 of those readings, doesn't matter which 4, and 1 of the supplementary readings. You can find the supplementary readings in a separate file on Brightspace, and I've pulled together readings that all speak in some way to the anthropology of ethics. And so you'll be able to find something there that is pertinent to whichever 4 you choose from the course readings. My expectation is that because this is the first time that many of you have written a literature review, it's the first time through is going to be a little rough. So 2 things about that. First, it's only worth 10 points of your final grade. So even if things don't go well, it's not a huge hit on your final grade. But secondly, I'll give you feedback and I'll give you an opportunity to revise it if you want. So that if you get it, you read my comments, you understand where things went awry, you have the opportunity to revise it and hand it in to me, and I'll grade it again. And that will bring to the end sort of the first part of the course, which is about developing the concepts that we want to use when we get to your research. So then we move on to the interviews. We'll have a little bit of time to prepare for the interviews, so we'll talk about how to interview, how to take notes during an interview, how to write up notes after your interview. I'll say more about that in a moment. And sort of how to progress from one interview to the next, so that you'll have 3 interviews, and you want them to hang together in a way. You don't want them to be so distinct from one another that you can't find associations between them. You can't find points of contact or connection between them. So you want to have kind of an overarching theme that brings these 3 interviews together in a way that when you discuss the research material that you've developed out of the interviews, it will make sense to put them together. Now, whether you want to have 3 interviews with 3 individuals, or if you want to have 1 interview with 2 interviewees and and the other 2 interviews with 1 interviewee each, that's up to you. There are advantages and disadvantages to interviewing more than 1 person at a time, And so some of that will have to do with how well you know people who you're interviewing and things like that. But that we'll have opportunities to talk about that before you do the interviews, and so those are decisions you don't need to make now. What I'll ask of you for each interview is a set of notes. Now, these are not the notes that you take during the interview. While you're in the interview, of course, you're going to be jotting things down, not trying necessarily to capture in full sentences everything that the interviewee says, but giving yourself enough that when you go back to those notes, you'll be able to remind yourself to recapture the scene as a whole. And that is what you will do in the notes that you write up afterward. You've done your interview, you've got your sort of scratch notes. They're going to look a lot like the notes that you take during classes, right? So you already know how to do this, to jot down enough to spur your memory later on. In the later on phase, you write up your notes, giving yourself an account of the interview as a whole. The setting, who it was, what you talked about, what the person's or people's responses were like, what their demeanor was like, how they express themselves through body language, say, as well as their words. You want to get all of that in. And so you are going to be giving me those notes, but you should think of them not as something that you're writing for me. You should think of them as something that you're writing for yourself, for sort of a future version of yourself who has to write a paper on the basis of these notes. And so the way that I'll grade them then will not be based on how impressive I think your interview was, but rather on how helpful I think these notes will be for you when you write your final paper. They're the main resource that you draw on for your paper. So the more detailed, the richer the descriptions are, the more work they're going to be able to do for you when you do your final paper. That's what I'm going to look at. If I get a single page of like point form notes, I'm going to think that you haven't really done much to help yourself out. That's not going to get a great grade. If I get several pages of fairly rich description with good detail, then I'll think, yeah, I can see how this is really going to help you out when you go to write up your final paper. In fact, maybe you'll be able just to cut and paste a lot of what you've put into those notes into the final paper. So you've already sort of done the work, some of the work anyway, of the writing that you'll need to do for the final paper anyway. That's what I'm going to look for. But I'm going to ask for something else as well. So you'll have 3 sets of notes, 1 for each interview, but you'll also have 2 in-class, you can call them progress reports if you want. So they're not presentations in the way that you've done presentations in the past. You don't need to make slides or anything like that. You're just going to talk about your interview. And the point of this is not to come in and say, this is how great my interview was. You should take note of the things that went well. But the idea is that this is a way of troubleshooting your interviews, so that when you talk about the first one, you can use that conversation in order to prepare for the second one, so that the second one will be more productive for you. That's the idea behind these reports. So you think of them then just as a conversation with me and with the other members of the class. You want to tell us the things that we'll need to know in order to be able to respond to whatever it is that's happened in the interview, to give us a sense of what went on during the interview, the things that you talked about, maybe if there were things that surprised you, that's worth taking note of. If there were details about say the setting of the interview that you're not quite sure at this point if they're going to be important for how you write up your paper, talk about them anyway. Maybe we'll be able to reflect collectively on how those observations will fit into the paper that you ultimately write. Okay, so next thing then is the final paper. That's what we want to get to in the end. The final paper will have 5 parts. I'll go through this again closer to time. You'll have an introduction where you sort of give the overarching topic, ethics in everyday life, and then your point of entry into that topic. So maybe it will be something like what it was to be a frontline worker during the pandemic, right? Maybe it will be something like that. So how it is that ethics made their appearance in the lives of people who were frontline workers. And then you focus your introduction down to a thesis statement where you say, in this paper, I argue that, and then whatever your argument is going to be, right? So that's going to be different from the literature review. Literature review is purely descriptive. Your final paper, you're making an argument of some kind. You're presenting a thesis. So you finished with the introduction, then you're going to go into a literature review that's going to include more sources than the first assignment. That one will include 9 sources. You can balance those sources in whatever way you like between the theoretical readings that we've done in class, and supplementary sources. So you can, in the past, I've wanted you to include all of the readings that we discussed in class. I'm going to be more flexible about that this time round. If there are supplementary sources that you find really interesting, you can lean more heavily on supplementary sources than those we read in class. It's up to you. But we will have the 4 at least that you've done for your first literature review, so you might as well hang on to those. What you're doing with the literature review for the paper is you're developing the conceptual framework that you're going to use to analyze and interpret the material that you've gathered through your interviews. So it's going to be its own discrete section. In the literature review, you don't talk about your research at all. You only talk about these sources and what these sources have to say about the anthropology of ethics, or just about the topic of ethics, however you like. So you're not talking about your research in the literature review at all. The next part then will be a very, very short piece where you discuss who you talked to, the circumstances in which you talked, things like that, so that I, as the reader, have kind of got a mental picture of what the interview looked like. Not what you talked about yet, but just sort of, I can picture the conversation in my head. Next part, you get to the main body of the essay, and that's where you discuss all of your research through the interviews. You discuss the material that you gathered there. You interpret that and you analyze it, but you bring it together along with the conceptual pieces that we've read in your literature review to start to develop your thesis. So the interview material is what you'll use as evidence or as data to try and say, this is the state of things, right? This is what I have learned, or the thesis that I've developed through the material that I've gathered in my interviews. And here's the way that these concepts bring my observations to light. And then you have a conclusion where you wrap it up. Okay, so that's the paper. These dates are all listed on the syllabus so that you can find them. You have a good, clear sense of when things are due. For the notes, you'll see I want them to me the day before the interview reports. I want to be able to read your notes over before I come into into class to hear your reports, because that way I'm in a better position to respond to what you say and to start talking about the connections that I see between your interviews and the readings that we've done. This, I think, is an important part of the overall project, because in the end, when you're writing your final paper, you want to be able to make these connections between the readings and the research material explicit. So I'll try and point out where I see these things in your presentations, in the reports, and I need to have your notes ahead of time so that I can do that. So you see that they're due before the day before the two presentation dates, or blocks of dates, I should say. Okay, and this is then how the points are laid out. You'll see the paper is worth half of the grade, of course, because it's the project that we're working toward. All right, so the readings. I'll go through this quickly just so you can sort of get a sense of the evolution of the readings. We're going to start on Thursday with Clara Hand's The Difficulty of Kindness. It's available on Blackboard, on Brightspace. So we're not going to get all the way through it on Thursday. We're going to have to take until next week to finish it, but get a start on the reading for Thursday anyway, so that at least the part that we talk about on Thursday, you'll have a sense of what's going on, and then finish it off over the weekend, so that when we come back on Tuesday, you'll be all familiar with the piece and be able to talk about it, ask questions about the things that puzzle you, make comments about the things that you found interesting or troublesome or intriguing, or whatever the case may be. So the next piece by Haider Al-Mohammed and Daniela Peluso, called The Ethics in the Rough Ground of the Everyday, has a similar kind of focus on the small details of everyday life. So Clara Han and Al-Mohammed and Peluso are very, very focused on how small, subtle things within everyday life might escape our attention as being ethically relevant. But once we pay attention to them, we can start to see the way that ethics are making their appearance throughout all kinds of interactions, small interactions over the course of people's everyday lives. Okay, moving on then. The city certificate, as noted above, will be due by week 4, and this is the first week that we start to look at someone who has just a different perspective than the kind of ordinary language anthropologists that we've started off with. Han and Al-Mohammed and Peluso fit into that ordinary language category. Zigon is doing something different. So partly this is in an effort to give you an alternative way of thinking about what an anthropology of morals or an anthropology of ethics could look like. And partly it's because he presents a certain kind of critique of the emphasis on everyday life. And so it's going to be a departure, conceptually, from what we've been looking at. From there, we move on to Michael Lambeck, who is going to mark a return to this ordinary language emphasis in the discussion of ethics, and then the critique that Michael Lempert presents of Lambeck's work in particular, but also of Veena Das's work that we're going to get to in the following weeks. And along with that, we have a very short piece by Michael Lambeck responding to Lempert. So you'll get a sense then of what an ordinary language approach to anthropology and the anthropology of ethics looks like, as well as a critique of that approach, so that you can sort of figure out what makes sense for you, what works for you, and what doesn't. If there are shortcomings to the ordinary ethics model of Lambeck and Das that you want to take account of, or if you think that that they respond effectively to these kinds of criticisms, and that's the kind of thing that might come up in your literature review. And then we wrap up with a couple of pieces by Vina Das. So Das and Lambeck, I think, are really the two major figures in both the anthropology of ethics and the ordinary ethics approach that comes through this ordinary language model that I'm talking. Model is overstating it, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Through ordinary language, this is where the course is going to pivot, right? So this is the final set of theoretical readings. From here on in, what we look at is just preparation for interviews. So we'll have some pieces on how to interview, how to take notes during interviews, how to transform the jottings that you take down during an interview into proper field notes. Field notes will be the things that you write up to give to me, and then we'll move into the interviews and the presentations. So the rest of the semester is going to be occupied with talking about your interviews, working out how to produce good notes, what to do with your notes. So we'll talk about how to code your notes so that you have an idea of how to take this growing body of information that you have and organize it in a way that it's easy for you to work with it. And then toward the end of the semester, you'll have already made progress on your papers. So we'll just devote some time to troubleshooting your papers, talking about the things that are coming up that are presenting problems for you, the things that are maybe taking you by surprise as you're writing about them, how to put together the conceptual readings with the research material, whatever it might be. That's what we'll turn to next. And then the final thing that I need to talk about, it makes me very sad that I have to talk about it, but I do. Every semester I get work given to me that is written by AI. It doesn't have to be ChatGPT, but ChatGPT is the most obvious candidate for this. And simply, if I get work that's not written by you, that's written by a machine, you get 0 on that assignment. So if you give me a literature review written not by you, but by ChatGPT or by Grammarly, that's an assignment that just gets 0. And the same goes for your final paper, of course. So one of the things that you have to do in each of these assignments, it's written into the assignments, both for the literature review and for the final paper, is you have to include a quote from at least one quote from every single source you discuss. You also have to have correct citation, right? So you need both of those elements. You need to have at least one quote, and you need to have proper citation for every source that you talk about. And I do that for two reasons. One is because that's good academic form, is to be able to quote properly and be able to cite properly. The other thing is that AI still at this point is terrible at doing that. It will, if you ask it for a quote from Vina Das, it will make up a quote and it will sound like Vina Das, but it's invented. It's just a made up bundle of words that has the sound of Vina Das's writing, but it's not going to be something from any of her work. And so that will obviously be a problem. Then I'll know, like, oh yeah, this is not something that you came up with yourself. This is something that came from a machine. So if you have quotes that don't come from the sources, then That's a way of getting a failing grade on the paper. You have to have quotes that do come from the sources. I'll talk about this again as we get closer to the time, but this is part of the assignment for the literature review. It is definitely part of the assignment for the final paper. It's not something where you can get by just with summaries in your own words of what the pieces say. You do that, but you also have to have quotations. Okay, so that's a sour note to end on. I'm afraid I don't like doing the policing thing, but it happens so frequently that I've got to talk about it. So there it is. Anyway, so we'll have lots of time through the semester to talk about all of the things that have come up in the syllabus and in this presentation. But you should also feel free to email me with any questions you have at any time through the semester, and I'll try to respond to them quickly. I would rather get emails about things that leave you uncertain and answer them then than get papers that have things that are a real problem that you could have just asked about and we could deal with them. I'm much happier to do that work sort of on the front end than have to deal with it later. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a good semester.